made reshaping trade its priority. So let's start there. Professor Stiglitz, we know that you're no fan of the president's trade policies. You've said he's fixating on a bygone problem with the steel and aluminum tariffs. He's focusing on bilateral trade deficits instead of multilateral deficits. How much do trade conflicts really matter here? Because right now it's at the heart of the China-US relationship. Should it be?
Well, obviously, we can't ignore it. But let me say, as you mentioned in those remarks, his fixation with the bilateral trade deficit is really primitive, and they know it's wrong. They're operating at a totally different level of sophistication that Trump is. I mean, they understand economics.
You're saying China understands?
China understands. Okay. And they're laughing, basically, at Trump. I mean, when I say they, everybody in China who is in the, you might say, elite circle is laughing. So let me give you an example you mentioned Graham Allison in the discussion when we were in China a couple of weeks ago, and we had the idea that came up. You could solve the bilateral trade deficit overnight. All that China would have to do is buy $100 billion of American oil. Mm-hmm. It could then take that oil and sell it anywhere in the rest of the world, or it could displace its purchases itself. It would eliminate the bilateral trade deficit. It would not change anything in the world. So
it wouldn't create the jobs that the president.
It wouldn't create the jobs the president is talking about. So it just emphasizes that this fixation on the bilateral trade deficit is really stupid.
Is misguided.
But the other part that he's focusing on repeatedly, and this comes up in the NAFTA negotiations as well, is a fixation with manufacturing. Mm-hmm. So one of the, again, absurd from an economic point of view aspects of negotiations is that we have an overall trade surplus with Canada. Now you might say, he seems to say when a country has a trade, when we have a trade deficit with the country, he says that country is playing unfair. So he ought to be saying the U.S. is unfair to Canada. But that's not what he says, of course.
Right.
What he says is, but the surplus is in services, and the deficit is in goods. And services don't matter. Now, a lot of you are probably in financial services. You probably think that you do matter. And you are right. And I am in education. Export of educational services is one of America's major industries.
So he's picking and choosing here, clearly. John, jump in here, because this approach, the professor describes it as the world is laughing at us. It spooked investors, the way that the U.S. is going about it. Mm-hmm. China's response has been more measured and has actually soothed investors. If you see the response to Xi Jinping's address at the Boao conference, opening up parts of the financial sector, for instance. Mm-hmm. How much do you take China's response at face value? Is it a reliable actor here?
Well, yes, let me just say one thing. It's always great to be here with Joe, one of the smartest people I know, and you always know where he stands. Let me give just a little more hopeful
Please.
spin that this apparent fixation on manufacturing and trade is a way of communicating a concern and getting things in motion. But when it sits down, when folks sit down to discuss issues, that it's going to be hopefully way more sophisticated than that. So,
well, let me say, I have had the chance of being at meetings. Yeah. They haven't actually asked me for their advice, yeah. But
I wonder why.
But I've been at meetings where like at Davos, where the administration people are there. And seemingly speaking openly, I don't have much confidence. And just to give you
got that drift.
One element of the distinction between the sophistication of China and the lack of that in the United States is on education policy. Mm-hmm. You mentioned, their 2025 policy. That's based on a recognition that they are a developing country. We think it's a big developing country, but their per capita income is 1/5 of the United States. So they want to develop. I mean, that's absolutely, obviously any developing country has an aspiration of closing that per capita income gap. And that's going to require investments across the board, infrastructure, but also education. The administration, believe it or not, says that we're actually investing too much in higher education and is trying to reduce it. And for the first time, I think, ever in any advanced country, there's a tax against our leading educational institutions like Harvard and Princeton.
Which we've seen in the latest tax reform bill.
Exactly.
as well.
Rather than encouraging those, it's actually taxing it.
Right.
Ron?
So now back to your question. Are the Chinese serious about economic reform, as I assume that's what you were asking? And certainly we've seen big changes over the past number of years. Remember when there were significant complaints about the Chinese currency being significantly undervalued, no longer the case. When China was running massive current account surpluses, no longer the case. And now the question is, are they going to carry through the market-oriented reforms that have been promised first in the economic policy described in the third plenum at the beginning of the President Xi's first term, and more recently in the 13th five-year plan. The speech that you just referred to suggests an intention to move forward. Recent nominations of new senior officials in the Xi administration point towards progress on reform. The speech also last week by Yi Gang, the new governor of the People's Bank of China, points to a bunch of specific measures in the next few months to start to open up the financial sector. If these things are carried through on the one hand, and at the same time there's a sense that China remains willing to live by the international rules of trade as laid out in the WTO, then I think we're moving a long way forward. And just parenthetically, Peter Navarro, the president's advisor on trade, just published an article a few days ago in the Financial Times in which his claim is that China is, I think the words were, breaking every rule of the WTO. So
first, let me reinforce what John said about my perception that they are committed to change. There's an expression, personnel is policy.
Yes.
The people you put in positions reflects where you think you're going. And the people that have been put in economic power are...
on the U.S. side?
No,
on China's side.
On China's side are sophisticated, market-oriented people, understand the limits of market, but are also well-educated. Yi Gang was a professor in the United States. Li Hu, who is described often as the economic czar, spent time in Harvard. And all of these people in that inner circle are very close to a lot of people in the West. So every time I go to China for the last several years, well before he got this position, Li Hu would ask to meet with us. And and the same thing as we met with Yi Gang just a couple weeks ago, and these are people who've been interacting and discussing economic issues very, very.
They have credibility.
So I think they have a lot of credibility. But let me say one more thing about the WTO in Navarro's article. The WTO provides a framework for adjudicating disputes. If you think that they are violating, if the United States thinks they're violating WTO rules, you file a case. And what is remarkable about the Trump administration is that they have not filed those cases. So you have to guess,